So I was just saying that honestly, very, very inspiring, something that does give a lot of inspiration to anybody who's tuning into this. And that being said, at Swechha as well, we believe in climate change and advocacy around it being a youth-driven movement. So, that being said, there's a lot of buzz around this. Every time I log into social media, I look at newspapers, I see everybody talking about climate change. And with the space being so nascent and there's so much to do in this space. I wanted to understand, is there any intricacy, is there any interlinkage with climate change, with employment? What do you understand or label as green jobs? Have you heard of these? Have you talked about these in the past? And do tell us, share your 2 cents on the same.
Right. Well, I think firstly, of course, nowadays with all these buzzwords, whether it's AI, crypto, green jobs, a lot of these buzzwords are continuously evolving. But I can tell you that, for the layman and I think green jobs very essentially, very simply put, it was in fact, I'd read some ILO, the International Labor Organization's report about a year or two ago. And I remember vaguely that there were two key features, right, of these green jobs. One is that it's any job really which contributes towards the preservation of the environment, and the second is and or the restoration of the environment. Right now, people typically assume that green jobs can only be, say, pertaining to renewable energy or to energy efficiency, or I don't know, those kinds of things. But we have to realize that green jobs are everywhere, right? There are green jobs in mining, there are green jobs in steel and petrochemicals. Any job which converts environmental damage to environmental good or environmental benefit, or tries to mitigate or reduce the impact of environmental damage, is a green job, right? Um, and of course it has to be sort of impact driven, result oriented, otherwise there's a lot of greenwashing that can also happen. Talking about how to get exposure to these green jobs, how to get involved, I think the best, I mean, speaking from personal experience, I think the best way to sort of get a sense of these jobs is internships, right? I mentioned earlier that I'm keen to sort of pursue a career in sustainability. And for me, I was not very sure of that until 2 years ago, because for the past 7 or 8 years, at the end of the day, even though it was not a CV building exercise, when, and especially in the Indian education system, there's your academics and there's everything else, right? So my degree may have been in political science, but my everything else was sustainability, right? You call that extracurriculars, you call it whatever you want. Um, so I think the solution to getting exposure to green jobs is internships, right? And that's what I did over the past 2 years. Last year I interned with Nestle's climate change team. This year I'm interning with PwC's ESG consulting team. And I think the it really gives you insights into whether this sector, this kind of job is for you or not. Over and above that, there are things nowadays which I recently learned of called externships. There are, of course, a few organizations which are at the forefront of this. Um, but there are these externships by Nat Geo, the Nature Conservancy, several of them. And I went in very skeptical, and they're paid, a lot of them, by the way, and in US dollars, so that's exciting. But I went in very skeptical. What will I do? What will I learn? It's like watching some videos, and I'm ashamed to say, because of other commitments, I was actually, I took up one of these. I was also visiting Africa for this climate change conference, international conference, where I was talking on climate change. So I could not complete this externship. But whatever little I saw of it, I have to say I was very impressed. It was the kind of information, the kind of learning is fantastic. So these are just a few avenues in which you can get exposure to the industry. And then, of course, you have, your LinkedIn and all of these other websites which can help you actively pursue such opportunities if one is interested in them.
Right. I wanted to actually take one point from there, what you talked about, just learning on ground, learning the right skills. And given that our curriculum we've been bereft of learning things the right way, do you think that the way that we've grown up, the way we've studied, especially CBSE, I mean, most of the kids who've studied in Indian schools, or let's say for that matter, other boards as well, including climate change or the aspects of climate advocacy as part of our curriculums, is that something that you would recommend? Do you think that should be something that even the new, the NEP that is coming out, is that something we should focus on? And apart from that, what kind of skills do you think that people should actually pick up for the kind of these internships that you've talked about? Because it honestly sounds so interesting, but for somebody to even if not to ape the kind of things that you've done, but emulate from what you've done, what would be your piece of advice?
I think, well, I mean, it's so firstly, I have to say I came from ICSE and I have my ICSE superiority complex there.
Right.
But
Of course you do.
that that being said, no, I mean, I've jokes apart, I've seen NCRT, I've seen the CBSE textbooks, or ICSE for that matter, even IB for that matter. No education board has nailed climate education correctly. Far from it, right? We're a long way away from nailing it down correctly. Um, why is it necessary? Well, because of the simple fact that, that's where you learn about it in the first place, right? It's only now in the past year or two that we've seen, um, you know, it climate change being spoken about in OTT, such as, I don't know, Seaspiracy and A Life on Our Planet and all of those things. But even those, I mean, you can say what you want, but even those have a very, I won't say narrow, but a very definitive fixed view into climate change, right? Um, I mean, the fact of the matter is that education is where one learns about it, and it's fundamental. But where does the problem come in, right? The problem comes in that in some education systems, it's very shallow. It's not in depth. The topic is not spoken about in too much depth. But by and large, the central problem is that the education boards are not thinking of this from the student's perspective, right? What is a student's perspective on education, especially in grade 7 or 8 when such topics are introduced? It's, you know, exam dena hai, I have to take these exams, I have to get the grades, I have to clear it. What do? You wrote learn, right? So climate change, unfortunately, has been reduced very literally to a textbook definition, as has sustainability, and that's where our problem lies, right? Because even if you look at it from the university education perspective, today the University Grants Commission mandates um, environmental studies being a mandatory subject in the first year of an undergraduate degree being offered in India, right? Um, Half the time there are no specialized professors teaching it, more often than not, whether it's a private university, whether it's a public university, more than half the time an econ professor is teaching environmental science, right? A political science professor is teaching environmental science. Sure, I'm not saying they don't have the skills to do so, but someone who's qualified in that space would be far better suited to do the same job, right? And beyond a point, when something is mandated, whether it's at the school level, whether it's at the college level, it's done because it's mandated. It's not done because the teacher is passionate about it, right? So that's what we need. We need teachers who are passionate. We need teachers who will say, okay, you know what, this is the definition, but tear this page out. This is what I want you to know about climate change. And then you go about that, right? So that's where the importance comes in, and that's what we need to work towards for sure.
You talked about things being mandated, and that is something that comes with a certain sense of authority, governing bodies, especially education systems. When you talk about revamping them completely, that has to do a lot with, some certain authority. That being said, do you think that when it comes to climate change, you can talk all you want all about it, and still, do you think it does boil down to political will? Are there ways that we can, as youngsters, as the bustling youth of this international order that we're in right now, sort of be a part of this movement and also join, let's say, climb up the ranks maybe, and represent at different forums, but in, let's say, individual capacities, something of a similar fashion is what you're doing right now.
Right. So, well, I'm going to give a long answer to this one, but I think we need to be very clear about one thing first, and that is, or two things, but the most important one perhaps would be that today we are in a position where, we're in a position where the youth have a seat at the table, at least more so than we did 5 or 7 or 10 years ago, right? But at the same time, we must ask ourselves the question, is it enough? And the answer is no, right? Because in spite of the best efforts of the UN, and this is one thing I would say the UN has probably actually tried to put their best efforts towards, um, is to increase representation of the global south. In spite of their best efforts in doing that, they've not been entirely successful, right? Um, and that's it's the same for all other international organizations, but we're getting better, we're getting there. But the fundamental problem remains that a seat at the table is not the same thing as a say at the table, and that's what we need. Perhaps what we've been doing all this while, I don't know whether it's because we're enamored by the charm of these international conferences, or whether it's because first we thought let's get there, then we'll solve the next thing. But all youth activists, youth movements have been focused on a sort of limited agenda of getting a seat at the table first. And when I say a seat at the table, I mean whether it's a national conference, international conference, local governing body, international governing body, any of these things. We've been focused on a seat at the table. But what we haven't realized is that very often in such cases, a seat is not automatically a say, right? And we need a say at the table. So that's what we sort of need to work towards. And I mean, half the battle's won if you have the seat, right? It's really about getting the others to take you seriously, and of course creating a legitimate space for yourself, for what you're saying to be taken not just seriously but also for it to be acted upon. So that's point number one. The other sort of contextual background which is necessary for me to answer this question is that today in the world at large, but specifically in developing countries such as India, we're facing a catch 22. We're in a very, very unique position, where we have institutions on one side, by which I mean the governments and corporates, etc. And on the other side, we have individuals, right? And we have individuals saying that, why should I do anything on climate change? I can't do anything until institutions bring about a change, right? Institutions, on the other hand, are saying that, we've done our bit. We've introduced XYZ law. We are fulfilling XYZ requirement of the government, and either people aren't following it or they don't care. But we've done what was written on paper. We are done, right? Hands up, we've done our job. So it's on people to implement and follow it, right? So we're stuck in this vicious cycle, this catch 22, where one is waiting for the other, right? Now, how do we come out of this? Let's take the example of, the firecracker ban, which the Supreme Court, the National Green Tribunal, has sort of mandated over the past 5 to 6 years or more. um, right now, we all know that, I mean, for the past so many years, this ban has been flouted shamelessly, especially around the time of Diwali, right? And I mean, take 2022 take 2020 for example. We had 12,000 complaints within Delhi NCR itself of firecrackers being burst, right? Imagine the unreported numbers. But let's say those 12,000 complaints in 2021, or even 2 or 3 years later, let's say by next year, 23, those 12,000 complaints become 3,000 complaints, right? What does that do for society? It does several things, right? it sends out a message to our policymakers and to these institutions that a legislation or a ban which was enforced, which was previously being shamelessly flouted and thereby could not be enforced because you can't arrest 12,000 people in one night, right? If those 12,000 become 3,000, that shows to institutions that 9,000 people have woken up and started to care about this, right? Um, and what does that mean to policymakers and politicians? That translates to 9,000 votes, because a policymaker or a politician will then go to his next electoral rally and say, "Oh, we should ban firecrackers," and those 9,000 people will vote for him, right? So that's how we bring about this change. And I think, I mean, a fundamental sort of, there's always this debate: is it with citizens, is it with institutions, right? Is it individual action or is it governmental change? I think there's two ways to look at it. The first is that, there are statistics in I can't remember the report. There's a very famous peer reviewed journal which published um, this statistic that if even 1 billion people did their bit for their planet, right, 1 billion is less than the population of India totally. Even if 1 billion people did their bit for the planet, we could cut carbon emissions by 20%. That's huge, right, without any institutions. The other way to look at this is that yes, institutional action is necessary to bring about the change that we need to stop emissions, to stop heating below 2 degrees by 2100. But for that to happen, the ball needs to be set in motion by individual action. Otherwise, we will never come out of that catch 22. So that's where we stand on representation, individual action, this entire debate about policymakers. I think individual action has to be left, right, and center, and that can only come when we advocate for not just a seat but also a say at the table.
That's very interesting because, honestly, someday in the
I can't hear
future,
you.
better.
Sorry. Yeah.
Am I
Yeah.
audible?
Yeah.
I was saying that someday in the future, if this was to become the norm, we had climate crusaders aplenty. That would actually be so inspirational because honestly, that is the future. And that being said, I mean, there's one name that we keep hearing time and again, right? Greta Thunberg has made a name for herself. She's carved a niche. Um, that being said, she's taken the world by storm. Would that similar ripple effect, do you think a similar pattern or a climate movement, can we see that being reproduced in India as well?
Well, I have to say one thing first. I think Greta Thunberg has indeed taken the world by storm. And I think that was very necessary. I mean, kudos to her. But I don't think we need to replicate the Greta Thunberg movement. I think we need, at the cost of sounding extremely vain, I would say we need the Abhiir Bhalla effect, or we need any other climate movement which is led by Indians, is for Indians, um, and is completely Indian in origin, right? Um, Let me tell you that, you know, every, I mean, you can look at the Commonwealth as perhaps a common collective identity where, suffrage from climate change is common across colonies because we shared a similar colonial past, right? Um, but other than that, I don't think, other than that one segmentation, there you can't compare the climate change journeys of any country, right? 40 years ago, the US, I mean, 40 years ago today, California and London had air quality which was far worse than what Delhi sees today, far worse, right? And at that time, you could not even monitor it beyond a point. Uh, but today, these two same countries, the US and England, turn around and say that, you know what, we're developing sustainably, we're using renewable energy. Why are you not doing that? They very conveniently ignore the fact that, they got to where they are by using their share of coal and they continue to use it. It's not like they're free from it, right? So that's very important in realizing every country has its own journey, and thereby every country must have its own environmental movement, right? And I have to say, I don't mean to discredit Greta. I've spoken to several of her team members over the years, but I found it very convenient, if I may say so, that Fridays for Future is held only on Fridays, right? To me, at least as a student, it seems like a ploy for a long weekend. Why could it not have been done on any other day of the week? Why was it a Friday, right? Just as an example. So again, here the point is not to discredit the movement. The idea is to say that there are different messages which will appeal to different audiences, right? And this is specific to climate movements as well. In India, you and I know that, our grandparents, our parents are obsessed with this idea of, um, the minute you're married, what's the next thing they want? They want kids, right? Bacche karo, good news ka bari hai, all of those things, right? um, so you have to make climate change messaging relevant. You can't go on saying air pollution, you can't go on saying global warming. You want someone to talk about and work on climate action and adopt sustainability in their day-to-day lives. Go to your grandparents, tell them, oh, you know what, you want grandkids, you want them to have a safe and healthy future. Um, then why don't you sort of stop burning this customary fool chadi on every Diwali? What's the need? Why do you want to do it for show or for glamour or for fun? There's no fun coming out of it, right? So that's why climate change messaging and thereby movements need to be unique, country specific, all of that. um, so yes and no, we should have an Indian climate movement, and we are getting there. Certainly getting there. I mean, you look at some of the oldest climate movements in the world. You look at Sundarlal Bahugana, you look at Pandurag Hedge. We've really led environmental movements historically, right? And inspired other countries as well. But there's yet a long way to go. But that doesn't mean we need to replicate anyone else. We need to have our own one. So yeah.
That's right. That's so interesting, and especially the fact that you said this should be like an Abhiir Bhalla movement right here. That's inspiration enough for, I think, everybody who's tuned in. Since we're a little short on time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to request you to sort of give us some sort of maybe some tips, since you mentioned day-to-day lives and how we can do this on an individual level, take steps towards sustainability, and any parting notes that you would want for the audience to listen to. So
Sure. So I think, I mean, it's fundamental for us to realize that when we're working on climate action and adopting sustainability, we can't go from 0 to 100 in 3 seconds like a Ferrari. That's what people try to do. Sustainability needs to be sustainable, and for that to happen, we need to make piecemeal changes in our lifestyles, right? Now, one way to look at it is the capital intensive, really fancy way of sustainability, and it works very well, right? You install solar panels, you develop a rainwater harvesting system in your household, you buy electric vehicles, all of that, right? At a step down, at a cheaper price point, you may look at bamboo toothbrushes. But unfortunately, this entire sort of approach to sustainability, I don't know why, but this entire approach to sustainability is often criticized. That, oh, environment is also becoming an industry. It's all a profit driven gimmick, all of these things. And my question always is, why? What's the problem? You know, uh, I mean, the world goes round because of the profit motive. So why not sustainability also be driven by that, right? Um, but there's always alternatives. If your house is too old or if it's too expensive to install a rainwater harvesting system, every household, whether it's the smallest slum or the largest mansion, everyone has pots and pans or buckets, right? You can always put that out to collect rainwater and then use that to sort of clean your house, your laundry, your dishes, all of that, right? Um, on the flip side, bamboo toothbrushes, I mean, rural India did it and continues to do it, right? They use datuns, neem sticks as alternatives to toothbrushes. We don't need to be enamored by this sort of fancy, consumerism driven sustainability. So there are alternatives. Using public transport if you can't afford an electric vehicle. The Delhi metro is the world's first green metro system, And that's after the fact that none of the developed world has helped us, not to the extent that we needed, at least. So solutions are all around. It's about looking at it from a approachable perspective, doing it in bite-sized methods, and getting it done.
That seems like a wonderful, wonderful way that I think people on a very day to day basis can include things in their lives. These tiny steps, tiny milestones that you can have for your very own self. And very rightly said about how starting lines are different, but finishing lines have to be the very same, right? There is also an African philosophy about Ubuntu, how, people together have to reach towards the finishing goal. That being said, education is one way that you can reach masses. You can reach everyone from any age group, from the age of 2 to about 90, and you can make a difference. You can make an impact. Um, because we talked about classroom learning, we talked about how curriculum should be changed altogether. Do you think there are ways that we can implement, inculcate, include more learning around climate change? How can we do that? Except for just advocating, let's say, using or leveraging platforms like social media, are there any other such forums where people can actually come and talk about it? Because we've got Model United Nations, we've got, all these fancy, jazzy sort of forums where people come and debate about XYZ things. But again, it boils down to how there's not enough groundwork. So that being said, just wanted to know, are there any new or better avenues where people could come and speak about things?
Absolutely. I think, firstly, I hang on to words, and I have to say, Model United Nations, unfortunately, is quite, they're doing it wrong, right? Because MUN is often about showmanship rather than debate.
It's
Debates in and
changed.
of themselves, conventional debates are a very good place to sort of inculcate awareness, especially debates where people have time to prepare, because climate change is something where people would actually be forced to read up. Unlike a conventional debate, perhaps on gender equality or some one of those typical topics. Moving more specifically to address your question, um, how do we make climate education matter? How do we make climate education um, get adopted in different ways? I think, firstly, in today's world and in today's India more specifically, innovation and entrepreneurship are the name of the game. Right? There are so many young innovations which have been led by Indians, which focus on climate tech, climate, just sort of addressing climate change issues. Right? We had if I'm to give you an example off the top of my mind, there's Theli, which is led by
Yeah, I've heard
Ashay
about
Bhave.
them.
Yeah. So he makes plastic bags into shoes, and shoes which, mind you, are better, if not as good, at least in appearance and design. I don't know too much about shoes, but as good as your Nikes or your Jordans, and I hope they don't sue me for that. But yes, they're just as good. Um, right. Similarly, there's been Vinisha Umashankar, who invented the solar ironing cart. Where in India we have this concept of dhobis, your neighborhood cloth pressing people, who sort of so she invented the solar cart for them. And I think examples like this, not just, I'm not saying that they need to be included in our education curriculum. I'm saying they need to be showed videos. Students need to be shown videos on this, and more than that, they need to be involved in such activities. So just like in schools we have debate competitions, we need innovation competitions, hackathons, ideathons, all of these things, on specific issues of climate change. Because, I mean, what? You put 100 12th graders in a room and you tell them that, for the next 2 days, you will be thinking of ideas on how to address, say, XYZ issue in sustainability. Sure, I mean, maybe 80 of them will be generic solar panels, rainwater harvesting, etc. But I'm sure 20 of them at least will go above and beyond to make, you know, unique solutions, and 5 of them perhaps will be really implementable, you know. Um, so these kind of activities are the way forward. To give you an example, there's this very interesting platform called Uplink, and they had partnered with 1T or something like that, which was hosted by the World Economic Forum for sourcing and scaling these youth-based innovations. Like, I gave you the examples of to protect the environment and the planet. Right, there was this fascinating, interesting initiative. I think uh, it was called the Cabula Initiative, which aimed to transform desertified land into Mediterranean forests, which actually used to be there 100 or 200 years ago, and now that place was a desert, right? And it's got a grant. So education needs to be action oriented, in essence. That's what I'm really saying, right? It needs to be something which forces students to think, research, and act on. And it can be tailored to different, I know probably sixth graders can't do stuff like this, but they can definitely watch videos. They can definitely have discussion circles. In my university, we've had this very successful initiative, which I then went on to copy the name for my podcast called Candid Climate Conversations, where we used to meet once in 2 weeks on campus and we used to just talk. Um, Earlier you and I were talking about different issues on climate variability and climate change. Just issues like that we talk about, we explain. Peer learning, that's the best way to do things. So stuff like that really is going to be successful if we implement it.
Yeah, and with the right, I think, approach to it, like you said, being action oriented, given that there's so many organizations that you can collaborate with. And I mean, without a doubt, I mean, if I have to talk about Swechha, and the initiative has been, I think, a strong force when it comes to climate advocacy for the last 20 years and enhancing the amount of awareness around environmental conservation, around building, let's say, a very, very resilient future where you and I can actually talk about these things even 20 years, 30 years, 40 years down the line, and absolutely sort of have those learnings passed on to the future generations as well. With that, thank you very much. Since we are coming to the close of this podcast, I honestly wanted to thank you for your time, Abhiir, and all these nuggets of wisdom that you've shared with us today. Honestly, I don't think there is any other way of us hearing about climate change instead of people drilling it into our heads. I think it was the most I think it was very, very conversant of you, and the way that you spoke, it was so easy. I think, especially for someone who's very young, for them to even understand what climate change is, or like the words that you used before, right? All these buzzwords that we talk about, sort of breaking it down into pieces to explain it to a layman, to a simple person. I think that's exactly what you've done for us today. So I really wish to thank you on behalf of our team. And once again, everybody who's listening, we really hope that you like this podcast and do tune in for the upcoming ones as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.